the Rocky Mountain MS Center's webinar series. Today's presentation will discuss examples of workplace accommodations for 6 common MS symptoms. It features Matthew McCord from the Job Accommodation Network. The Job Accommodation Network is the leading source of free, expert, and confidential guidance on job accommodations. Matthew will walk us through their 6-step process for handling an accommodation request, and he will give us a tour of the website to help us understand all of its benefits. This webinar features a lot of important information. If you missed something on a slide or want to hear it again, we are recording and it will be archived on our website at mscenter.org so you can replay it at any time. All live viewers will get the recording automatically sent to them. You will also receive a link to our evaluation survey. Please take a few minutes to fill this out to help us improve future programming. We'll reserve time at the end to answer questions from the audience. You can submit questions at any time by typing them into the Q&A box on your screen. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Matthew.
Alrighty, I'll go ahead and share my screen here real quick, and then we can get this ball rolling. Okay, looks like that is looking just fine. Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to our training on using Jan and the interactive process. My name's Matthew McCord, and I am one of the senior consultants on the motor team here at Jan. Let's begin by outlining what we'll be discussing today. So I'll begin by starting off with the types of services that we here at Jan provide. Then I'll take us through some of those common limitations that people with MS contact us about and some accommodations to help with those needs. Following this, I'll go over Jan's sample interactive process and then end off with a tour of the website. I'm sure you're all eager to get started, so let's begin. Let's begin with the Jan overview. Okay, so the Job Accommodation Network is a national consulting service that was established back in 1983. It provides guidance on job accommodations and disability employment issues. All of Jan's services are confidential and free to use. Jan is a service of the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. Serving customers across the United States and around the world for more than 35 years, Jan provides free one-on-one practical guidance and technical assistance on job accommodation solutions, Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act and related legislation, as well as self-employment and entrepreneurship options for people with disabilities. By providing trusted guidance on the ADA and practical accommodation solutions that benefit employers and individuals with medical conditions and disabilities, Jan helps everyone recognize the value and talents that qualified workers with disabilities add to the workforce. The Jan service provides individualized consultation, training on ADA and accommodation issues, and offers hundreds of related publications to assist you in the interactive accommodation process. The Jan staff is unsurpassed in its dedication to improving employment opportunities for individuals with disabilities by providing timely, accurate, and thorough information to its customers. We meet you where you are in the accommodation process. Jan consultants are highly qualified, experienced, and serve as a member of a specialized team. Those teams are our ADA team, our cognitive/neurological team, the motor team, the sensory team, and the self-employment team. In addition to providing expert consultation, some consulting staff design and deliver customized trainings, unlike this one, speak nationally on ADA and job accommodation issues, and also create Jan resources for the website. Collectively, the Jan consulting staff has more than 175 years of experience providing customized ADA technical assistance, job accommodation solutions, referrals, and trainings. The Jan staff has provided quality customer service to more than 700,000 customers, including employers, individuals with disabilities and their family members, legal, medical, and educational professionals, vocational rehab service providers, union representatives, and many more. Okay, Now that we have reviewed what JAN is, let's get into what sort of accommodations people with multiple sclerosis commonly find helpful to request. These will naturally not be an exhaustive overview of all possible accommodations for multiple sclerosis, but it should give a good starting point in the search for what will be helpful. To begin, we have accommodations for balancing issues. This need is best accommodated with a twofold approach. First, implementing accommodations to reduce the chance that a fall will occur in the first place, and second, minimizing the harm that will come about if a fall does happen. For options to reduce the chances of a fall happening, first, I think it's important to establish a plan of action for on-site emergencies, like, say, a fire. A plan of action is just that, a plan that the individual with the disability and the employer create so that everyone knows what to do when these unforeseen situations arise. It should answer questions like, does the individual need help in safely evacuating the building? If so, who will provide that help? Where should the individual wait for that help to find them? What equipment will be needed to get the individual safely out of the building? And so on. Coordinating with the local fire department and other emergency response teams is also a good idea in making a plan like this, so all who are present on the scene will be on the same page. Other accommodations to reduce the chance of a fall happening would be asking for the employer to install more grab bars or handrails that the individual can use to support themselves or catch themselves on, or by allowing the individual to use mobility aids like canes, walkers, or wheelchairs while they're working on site. As for accommodation options to minimize the harms involved with a fall, purchasing a fall alerting device can be helpful if the individual will need assistance, but there may not be someone within earshot that can provide that assistance. Padded edging to soften the corners of tables and desks are also a good option to reduce the severity of injuries. And if there are concerns with using stairs, relocating the workstation to the first floor is always a good option for that too. Moving on to accommodations for fine motor coordination issues, if you need to use motorized devices like power tools, lawn mowers, farming equipment, or the like for your job, then options to help dampen the effects of those motors vibrating the hands can really help. Anti-vibration gloves as well as anti-vibration tool wraps help to make it so those vibrations are felt less by the user, making keeping a hold of those things a lot easier. For riding lawnmowers and riding farm equipment, there are also anti-vibration seats that can be helpful here too, as well as for other needs like back pain. If you happen to work in a library, a school, or other environment that requires the use of a lot of books, then options to help you keep a hold of them and turn those pages can be helpful. Book holders come in different varieties. There are options that fit on your thumb like a ring to help keep the book open on a certain page. There are also options that are essentially stands you place the book into that holds it open for how you placed it in. Page turners are often wands that you can use to slide under the page and flip it over, but there are other varieties too, like options that are strapped onto the hand that you use to push the pages over, and some book stands also come with a motorized page turner built into them as well. Extra grip gloves and gripping aids are something of a catch-all option to give the user more gripping and handling support. You've likely seen extra grip gloves before in gardening and cooking supply sections of your stores. They are the gloves with the small bumps or dots over the palms and underside of the hand and can help keep a hold of a wide variety of things. For gripping aids, these come in a lot of shapes and sizes, but a good example are those plastic devices that are marketed to help with opening stuck jars in your kitchen. The same principle applies to a lot of other areas, but gripping aids like that can definitely be helpful in many situations. Speech recognition software or speech to text software can help reduce a computer keyboard or replace a computer keyboard rather well if the user is able to adequately articulate their words. There are various types of alternative keyboards out there as well, but sometimes we just need to approach using a computer in a different way. Speech recognition can also be a supplement where a keyboard is still usable, just not for the amount of time the job requires the keyboard to be used. For some highly specialized jobs, like, say, computer programming, speech recognition can still be useful, but will often require specialized scripting to make it work in those sorts of environments. Speech recognition is great at supplementing or replacing keyboards, but sometimes it is not as great at doing so for computer mice. For situations where no form of computer mouse will work for the user, touchscreens can be a good option to try. In addition, there are more disability-focused forms of input devices that replace mice, like foot pedal mice, as well as head movement and eye movement controlled camera mice. So if your job requires a lot of spreadsheets, an option that you might be able to pick up like this would be helpful where speech recognition kind of leaves you hanging. Finally, good old-fashioned writing aids are always a good standby option to consider here too, whether it's a ball-shaped pencil holder to make it so you don't have to do that very fine pinching motion as much, special pins with the ability to add weights inside of them to help reduce the impact of tremors, or nice thick pins designed to require minimal pressure to write with. There are a large variety of writing aids out there that you can try out to help. For fatigue accommodations, first and foremost, a common topic we talk about on the motor team is how many jobs really do not require the worker to constantly stand to do them. So allowing the use of stools or chairs can be an easy and effective option to reduce worker fatigue. Many employers feel that it makes a bad image to the customer, like the workers are lazy or inattentive. But often those concerns are not based on anything objective. It's more that the employer has it in their head that people think this way, and therefore they don't allow this because of that belief. But unless allowing an accommodation like this would cause an objectively verifiable impact on the business, and that impact would be significant, the employer would need to consider allowing an accommodation like this. So if the task can be done while seated, consider letting the worker sit. In situations where the job tasks actually do need to be done while standing, providing additional supports can be helpful. Anti-fatigue matting is likely one we are used to seeing in our day-to-day lives. Think of those mats that cashiers stand on while they're checking out your groceries. Those can be helpful, and they also come in wearable varieties as well, if the job requires you to do a lot of walking around and not just standing in one set place. There are also stand lean stools, which are stools that are designed for people to lean against instead of sitting on them. So those can help take some pressure off when you can't just sit on a stool like you normally would. For jobs that are done at a specific workstation, ensuring that those workstations are ergonomically designed and laid out can be very helpful in minimizing fatigue too. Ergonomic assessments can be helpful in identifying ways the workstation can be altered or products to purchase to make using it more ergonomically correct. As I'm sure a lot of us can attest to, maintaining a slightly uncomfortable position for a long period of time will lead to a lot of pain and fatigue. So nipping those seemingly small issues in the bud is always a good idea for long-term long-term comfort. Adjusting the schedule is a great option for fatigue-related concerns, be it flexing shift start times, making up time another day, or breaking up the workday by including more rest breaks. Modifying the schedule can help in a lot of ways with managing fatigue. Sometimes, though, the specific tasks that the job requires the individual do can be a problem in and of themselves. It is possible to have a job restructured as an accommodation, and one way that accommodation can help here is by reallocating certain job duties to other workers. So, if there is one or two specific tasks that cause most of the fatigue related problems, perhaps those tasks can be given to others instead. Keep in mind, this reallocation is only something employers must consider when the job duty in question is not considered an essential function of your job. So if your job was created to do that specific thing, or if a significant portion of your work time is spent doing that thing, then the employer likely would not have to consider reallocating it to someone else, but it still can be a powerful option to consider when it is possible. Finally, as the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us all, telework or working from home can be a great option for a lot of different needs. In this situation, eliminating the commute to and from work can be very helpful in managing fatigue. Not every job is compatible with remote work, of course, but for those that are, it can be very helpful too. For blurry vision, our sensory team suggests the following. First, remember that you can adjust your computer display's color settings and contrast settings. Tweaking them around a little bit can make a big difference. For instance, enabling your operating system's high contrast modes or using specific color combinations like yellow backgrounds with dark blue text can be helpful. For seeing the keys on your keyboard, there are expanded keyboards with larger keys. Some are also painted with high contrast colors as well to make distinguishing between them easier too. Along those same lines, you can also get special desk phones with larger number keys and also larger digital displays as well. Sometimes magnification is needed to make smaller text large enough to be able to see clearly. Head-mounted magnifiers can be great for both paper documents as well as computer use, but there are also computer software specifically designed to help magnify specific portions of the screen as well. A popular version of that software would be the product named Zoom Text, for instance. There is also screen reading software as well that will read the text on the screen aloud for you. A popular version of that sort of software would be a product named JAWS. And finally, they wanted me to be sure to include that you may want to speak with your optometrist about prescription eyeglass options that might be helpful. Sometimes a simple eye exam and new prescription glasses can do wonders here too. For heat intolerance, the simplest and best way would be to avoid those hot areas if possible. But that's just not realistic in every job, of course. So a good option to consider when we can't remain in climate-controlled areas would be cooling clothing. If you have experience in wearing full body suits like you see around Disneyland, you'll likely have seen these before. These are specialized vests and headwear and pants that are designed with either fans or water pouches inside of them to help prevent you from overheating. The options with water in them will naturally be heavy, but they can be very useful for a few hours of being out in that high heat. If your work is done in somewhat of a localized area, portable AC units or fans can naturally be very helpful. Along those same lines would be air deflectors or vent covers. These can help if you work in a climate-controlled area, but the issue is the heat coming out of the ventilation system is too much. Air deflectors can point the flow of that air into the room away from you so that it isn't blowing directly on you, while vent covers would block off that vent entirely. And similar to fatigue accommodations, schedule changes, job restructuring, and telework are all helpful here too. Maybe the individual is overheating and needs to take a break to go and cool down inside for a while before going back outside. Maybe the work that needs to be done outside can be done at a different time of the day when it's not as hot. Or maybe the individual can do their work from home where they can control the temperature to the best of their needs themselves. All helpful options to consider for heat sensitivities. For stress, effectively accommodating stress-related needs can vary quite a lot depending upon the situation. Rather than list some options to try, I thought it best to give a general outline to follow instead. Generally, a good starting point for this type of accommodation is to identify the specific triggers that cause the stress and then seek accommodations to help you better manage that stress. So this can amount to many different things depending on the situation. For example, if the stressor is speaking face to face with your supervisor, can that communication be done in another way, such as via email or a phone call or through Teams and other instant messaging softwares? If we can cut out that face to face aspect, it might be a lot easier for them to manage it. If the trigger is a job duty and no form of accommodation will help them to manage that, consider reallocating that duty if it's not an essential job function. Like we talked about before, sometimes just a simple shuffling around of marginal job duties can go a long way for people. But if it is an essential function and nothing can help them to manage it, that's when you would want to look at a reassignment. And for reassignment, that would generally be a vacant position that the individual is qualified to do as an accommodation. Um, there are accommodations that can be helpful even if a specific trigger cannot be identified, and those can include things like flexible scheduling or leave usage or allowing a service animal at work. So I wanted to include those if, you know, we can't even identify that specific trigger. Okay, now let's go into the interactive process. Overall, the interactive process is just a way to help the employer and the employee work together to figure out what sort of effective accommodation to provide. Federal law does not mandate that an interactive process be implemented by all employers. It also doesn't spell out what an interactive process looks like. However, it is suggested that one be used because of the benefits it provides to both employers and employees. So in response to that, we here at Jan developed a sample one that's available for free to use. You're free to tailor it to meet your needs, use it as is, or chuck it in the garbage can. It's however you want to use it. We suggest a 6-step process. These steps are recognizing an accommodation request, gathering information, exploring accommodation options, choosing an accommodation, implementing the accommodation, and monitoring the accommodation. So let's discuss these steps in detail. It's vitally important for employers to be able to recognize a request when one is made. Most requests come from the employee who's experiencing the problem. However, employers need to be ready to accept requests from family members, friends, coworkers who are requesting on behalf of someone else as well. According to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, an individual may use plain English and does not need to mention the law or use phrases like reasonable accommodation when requesting an accommodation. If it's indicated that an employee is having a problem and the problem is related to a medical condition, the employer should consider if the employee is making an accommodation request. All managers should be able and ready to recognize the accommodation request when it's made, even if they aren't the ones that process them. For example, if they get an accommodation request and it's not their job to process them, then that manager should be able to notify the proper person that a request is made so that they can act upon it. If an employer is unsure of whether someone has made a request for an accommodation, then we would encourage them to seek clarification on what's being requested and why. If they're still unsure, it's usually best to err on the side of caution and move forward with the interactive process under the assumption that one is being made. One reasoning for this is that unnecessary delays in processing an accommodation request can be a violation of the ADA, so it's important to act as quickly as possible. To facilitate this, employers should assign at least one person who's responsible for making sure accommodation requests are processed appropriately. This helps ensure a request has not been lost on someone's desk somewhere. In addition, employers should train all managers and supervisors in how to request accommodation requests and what to do with them if they get one. Okay, Now let's go through an example. An employee who was on FMLA notifies her employer that she will need additional leave after her 12 weeks of FMLA run out to recover from knee surgery. Did that individual make an accommodation request? Yes, they did. This is enough information to be considered an accommodation request. An accommodation of leave is needed due to the knee surgery. In this situation, we would encourage the employer to inquire as to how much additional leave is needed so that they will be able to determine if that leave can be provided or not. Need to know how much is needed, of course, before we can see if we can provide it. Okay, on to step 2. After the request has been made, now is the time to gather relevant information like medical documentation. Keep in mind, if the disability and need for accommodation is obvious to the employer, then medical documentation should not be gathered. For example, an employee who uses a wheelchair and is requesting a ramp to get into the building, that would be an obvious request, and we shouldn't halt the process to gather medical documentation on something obvious like that. If the need for accommodation is not obvious, then employers are entitled to request sufficient medical documentation. This includes things like what limitations are causing the problem, what job tasks are affected, things along those lines. It's usually a good idea to begin by getting information on the limitations that the individual experiences and how they're causing the problem that they're noticing in the workplace. This information is what will determine what sorts of accommodations will be effective. Remember that the individual experiencing the problem is intimately familiar with their own limitations and often have suggestions on what accommodations will work best for them. So, employers should certainly bring that up and ask them those questions, see if they have any ideas. And finally, remember that employers are limited in what medical documentation they can request. A good policy is to only ask for what is absolutely necessary. So asking for access to an employee's entire medical record is rarely, if ever, going to be appropriate. The general rule for medical documentation is when the disability or need for accommodation is not obvious, an employer may require that an employee provide documentation. Therefore, if the needs are already understood or if the employer due to already having information on file from a previous request or something like that, or if the needs are obvious, they can't gather more medical documentation on those needs. If the needs are not otherwise known or obvious, though, the provided documentation needs to be sufficient to allow the employer to confirm that the employee meets the ADA's definition of disability and that they need the reasonable accommodation that's being requested due to that disability. But employers cannot ask for documentation that's unrelated to making this determination. In regards to medical confidentiality, information from all medical inquiries must be kept apart from general personnel files as a separate confidential medical record, which is available only under limited situations. Those could be Number one, and a supervisor can be informed of necessary restrictions on work duties and of necessary accommodations. Number two, first aid personnel may be informed if the disability requires emergency treatment or in the event of an emergency like a fire. Number three, government officials investigating ADA compliance should naturally be provided the information they need upon request. And number four, relevant information may be provided to workers' compensation offices and also insurance companies. Now, for another example, a newly hired custodian with a seizure disorder uses a service animal to alert her that a seizure is coming on. She did not disclose during the phone interview, though, and thought it would be okay to tell her supervisor on the first day of work. This employer also has a no animal policy. Does this employer have everything that they need to proceed here? No, they do not. As seizure disorders are often unseen disabilities, we have no information to make the determination that there is an underlying medical condition here other than just the employee's word that there is. Also, we have no information to state that this animal that they've brought into work isn't just a pet, which would naturally not be permitted on site due to the no animal policy. So yeah, there is definitely a need for some more information here before we can allow that service animal on site. Okay, now for step 3. From here, we now know that the limitation and we also know what the problems it's posing. So we can explore accommodation options. Don't be afraid to think outside the box and brainstorm here. Accommodations are all about doing things differently to help overcome disability related limitations. So keep an open mind when exploring accommodation options. Just because something isn't fancy doesn't mean it won't be effective. A good place to begin is with suggestions that the individual can bring to the discussion. After all, they live with this condition every day, so they probably know exactly what they need to be successful. If the employer needs more ideas, they can certainly ask the medical provider for some suggestions. Some medical professionals will brainstorm accommodation ideas with employers. If they don't have any suggestions, then they could also probably say whether or not a potential accommodation idea would be helpful or not. In many instances, though, it may be necessary for a team of service providers to work together to develop an effective accommodation strategy. This step of the process is also normally where worksite evaluations, ergonomic assessments, and the like normally come into play too. If neither the individual nor their doctor have any ideas that would be effective, then you can certainly contact outside resources like rehabilitation engineers, disability related organizations and support groups, and of course, us here at JAN as well. As an example to illustrate step 3, we have a social worker with use of only one hand who has requested a work-related assistant do all of her keyboarding and case notes for her. Sometimes work-related aids and assistants are appropriate, sometimes they aren't. Just because this is the accommodation that the individual requested doesn't mean that that is the accommodation that the employer must provide. So, as the employer has the right to explore alternatives, how can they figure out what else might work? Well, just like we said before, contact us here at JAN. This is a great time to call us. It's our job to help develop accommodation ideas, and often that requires a lot of out of the box thinking, which we do all the time. In this specific example, we suggested that the employee use a combination of speech recognition software for those longer case notes and also a specially designed one-handed keyboard and foot pedal mouse for shorter typing tasks. Wanted to include some pictures there of the specific one-handed keyboard and pedal mouse that I was talking about, since there are specially designed ones that are completely redesigned the layout of the keys to be more ergonomic for people that only use one hand. Once accommodation options have been explored, it's time to choose what accommodation to implement. If there's more than one effective accommodation option, then the employer gets to choose which one they are going to implement. This means, for example, the employer may choose the lowest cost accommodation if that is their want. However, when possible, employers should consider the preferences of their employees. From a practical standpoint, we all like to choose what equipment or office furniture we use every day. Let's not forget that happy employees are oftentimes the most productive ones. However, how can we be sure that the accommodation that has been chosen will actually work for the individual's medical needs? It can be helpful to consider a trial assessment to test its effectiveness if we're not sure. This means allowing the accommodation to be put into place for a set period of time and then return to it later to evaluate how effective it was. It can also be helpful to create a small written agreement explaining the end date of the testing so nobody is surprised whenever things are revisited and potentially changed if things weren't working. For our next example, a customer service representative with diabetes had a strong body odor that could not be reduced until they got the diabetes under control. He is requested to work from home as an accommodation because of that. His employer was considering putting up some cubicle walls and installing an air purifier in his work area to accommodate him. His job could be done from home, but the employer was concerned about unnecessarily isolating the employee by allowing that work from home. So suddenly, this has become a very tricky situation. After all, the ADA prohibits unnecessary segregation. So now the employer is scared to permit the telework, even though that's what the individual themselves wanted. So after speaking with the employer learned that the employee didn't feel like they were being isolated at all. It was their choice to work from home, not the employer forcing them to work from home. He was more worried about the negative attention the cubicle walls and the air purifier would draw to him rather than him not being physically present in the office, which in this situation was pretty common. People tended to have a hybrid schedule and would be in and out of the office all the time. So after having that conversation with the employer realized that this option, the telework, really was a win-win for both of them. There is more to providing an accommodation, though, than simply giving the individual what they need. Employers may need to provide assistance in setting up new equipment or training in that equipment's use. Individuals may also need help adjusting to the accommodation. For instance, if the accommodation is working from home, there are unique challenges inherent to that accommodation that might require additional time and support to adjust to. Due to the confidentiality requirements of medical documentation, it's also important to discuss the individual's accommodation only with those who are essential in implementing or providing it. Managers and supervisors might need to know about the accommodation for it to be implemented, but others should not be permitted access to that information. Establishing a point of contact that the individual can raise concerns about their accommodation with can also help to ensure success. This often allows for issues to be handled much more quickly. After all, it's much easier and efficient to work on solutions now rather than waiting until weeks or months pass and the accommodation is revisited, only for people to find out that it hasn't been working well all along. Our next example involves a secretary with a 10-pound lifting restriction, and they needed to get some bulk items weighing more than 10 pounds out of a storage closet. Her employer purchased her a small lifting device meant for office settings. Has the employer done everything that needs to be done to fulfill this request, though? No, not quite. There's still more that needs to be done. That lifting device likely needs to be assembled, for one. The employee might need training in how to use it appropriately, for two. And number three, the employer may need to set up certain paths through the workplace where that device can be used so that other employees know to avoid those areas when needed. That way, we don't have unintentional crunched toes from someone walking around a corner and they're getting their toe crunched by a wheel. Monitoring the accommodation once it's been implemented is often a forgotten part of the interactive process, but it is just as important as the other 5 steps. Be sure that the individual can troubleshoot basic issues with equipment or devices and know who to contact when things aren't working properly. Despite this, though, the accommodation can stop being effective for various reasons. Those can include things like the individual's medical needs can change, the workplace equipment involved can change, the job duties can change, the workplace itself can change if we're moving offices, or the accommodation becomes an undue hardship for the employer to continue to provide. So, if it's determined that the particular accommodation that was permitted is no longer effective, then we would want to go back to step 3 and look at other options again. It's also important to let individuals know that they can request the accommodation be revisited at any time, and that it's important for them to do so if they're concerned that their performance is starting to suffer. For our last example, an auditor was provided speech recognition software as an accommodation about a year ago. Recently, the employer purchased a new database software, only to find out that the speech recognition would not work with that new database. How could the employer have avoided that problem? Well, it's entirely possible that it could have been avoided. When new products such as a database or equipment are purchased, it's important to remember the existing accommodations that are already in place so that accessibility issues can be considered in advance. Because of this, it can be very helpful to touch base with individuals who have accommodations that may be impacted by this sort of a change. That way, issues can be worked around before implementing that big change, or if nothing else, allow everyone time to look into another option that would be compatible. Computer technology is continually changing, so it's important to keep in mind as software changes, then the types of accommodations will likely need to be updated at some point too. This goes for much more than computer equipment, though. We often rearrange workstations and offices, but sometimes we had alternative lighting or redirected airflow as an accommodation. Those situations would similarly need to be taken into account before those changes are made. Otherwise, we're going to have to do another accommodation review and try to fix things once we break them. Now that we reviewed the interactive process, let's take a look at commonly used areas of the JAN website. Here are two images of the JAN homepage. One of the major benefits of our newer website design that you're seeing here is that we made some of our more commonly used features much easier to access. At the top of the page, I know it's kind of difficult to see, we have our most commonly used resources linked directly up there at the top for your convenience. Let's go through those pages together so we can become familiar with them and you know where to look when you need to research something. So the first one is our COVID-19 page. As I'm sure you all can imagine, this has become one of our most popular pages on our site. It contains several resources, both homemade here at JAN, as well as some created by other organizations too, to assist with the tough questions that COVID brought up for us. To highlight a few of my favorite in-house created resources found on that page, here are a few I would recommend. Those are processing vaccination accommodation requests, a practical approach to telework as an accommodation during the pandemic, ADA and accommodation lessons learned, COVID-19 edition, accommodation strategies for returning to the workplace, and masks for COVID-19 management and ADA accommodations. Next up, we have our information by role pages. These pages were designed to be something of a hub page to guide users to commonly needed information, depending upon what role they're fulfilling at the time. The first of the two that we'll talk about today is the one for employers. The only reason why I have that one first is because it's the next one on the list. It's not more important than the other. So, in addition to generalized ADA and accommodation information, this page has resources to assist with things like developing policies and procedures for handling requests, answering nitty-gritty aspects that arise when processing those requests, improving disability inclusion in the workplace, and seeking training or maintaining certifications. On the slide, I've once again linked 5 of the resources that I encourage people to check out on this page. Those are 5 practical tips for providing and maintaining effective job accommodations, a link to our page full of various sample forms, a link to our page with sample policies, processes, and even more sample forms, avoiding the waiting place after requesting a medical information, and recertifying the ongoing need for accommodation. Our second information by role page is the one specifically for individuals. This page is a great place to start your journey on understanding your rights under the ADA. Within, you can find several publications on topics like when and how to disclose your disability, negotiating the accommodations that you need, how to proceed if you think your rights have been violated, and much, much more. To highlight a few of the popular ones, I would be sure to check out the Employee's Practical Guide to Requesting and Negotiating Reasonable Accommodation under the ADA, Sample Language for Accommodation Request Letters, Practical Guidance for Medical Professionals, Providing Sufficient Medical Documentation in Support of a Patient's Accommodation Request, Leave as an Ineffective Accommodation, and Dealing with Improper Requests for Medical Documentation from an Employer. That one is actually quite helpful. I would definitely encourage that last one if you're in that situation. Moving on to our A to Z lists. or the A to Z of Disabilities and Accommodation Index, if you would prefer to use its formal title. Being an index, this is the part of the website that is a treasure trove of links to explore. You can switch between different views using the tabs near the middle of the page that I've pointed that arrow at for you on the slide. You can swap between by disability, by limitation, by work-related function, by topic, and by accommodation. The index defaults to the by disability view. So when you access it, you'll see various names of medical conditions at the bottom of the page where that arrow is now. You can click on those to find out more about those conditions and common accommodations that people find helpful if they have that condition. Keep in mind that this isn't intended to be an exhaustive list. So simply because you don't see the condition that you have on here doesn't mean that there's nothing here for you. In that situation, feel free to review similar conditions or utilize the by limitation tab instead. Say if you're needing accommodations because a specific condition causes you to have a lifting restriction, for instance, then our by limitation page on lifting should be very helpful for you. Likewise, if you have issues with commuting into work, our by work related function tabs page on commutes should be very helpful. Feel free to poke around with it. There's a lot of useful information in this one. Now let's go over the ADA library. Within you will find resources on all aspects of the ADA, from Title I through Title V, the Amendments Act, and much more. However, keep in mind that as we here at Gen focus on the employment-related areas of the ADA, the vast majority of the guidance we have on our site is tailored towards Title I and the Amendments Act in particular, not as much on the rest of the ADA. The technical assistance on the ADA we provide is taken from enforcement guidance documents that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has released. So if you ever want to review those guidance documents for yourself, you can find links to several of them here in the ADA library too. If you're the kind of person that likes to get information directly from the horse's mouth, or if you happen to be dealing with someone who is particularly stubborn, the ADA library might be helpful for you to push through that roadblock. Next up, we have JAN's Searchable Online Accommodation Resource, or SOAR. JAN veterans will remember our old website. SOAR looked really different back then. Now it's been redesigned to make it much more straightforward to use. If you see the topic you're needing information on the page, you can just click on that button and it'll take you to the search for it. If not, you can just type in whatever it is you need and click search, and you're on your way. SOAR lets users explore various accommodation options. These accommodation ideas are naturally not all-inclusive, though. If you don't find answers to your questions, feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to point you to where you need to go. Moving on to the behemoth itself, that would be our listing of publications and articles. This page is massive. It houses just about everything that someone at JAN has ever written. Don't worry though, if something is no longer helpful, we will take it down and update it if new information is needed. For the publication portion of the page, let's start off with our Accommodation and Compliance Series publications. They're something of a precursor to our A to Z lists. You can think of them as a pen and paper version of one of those pages on that index before that index existed. Our Consultants Corner articles are more topical, and because of this cover a wider array of issues. In essence, when a consultant goes hunting for something on the website that they just know we have on our website, but finds out that we actually don't have something on that, that's usually how a Consultant's Corner article is born. The case studies publications on here focus on accommodating workers in specific fields, like the food service industry or the healthcare industry. For the article portion of the page, it begins with our newsletter, which you're welcome to subscribe to if you'd like. It used to be a quarterly newsletter, but we've recently changed it to a more as needed basis. That way we can create and release them in more timely manner when topics arise and people need help with them. The JAN blog has a lot of useful information for individuals wanting to start their own business, but it also has a wide variety of other topics within it too. The blog stays freeform, and sometimes a blog post might not even be related to the ADA at all. Finally, our effective accommodation practice series articles are designed to be step-by-step guides or lists of tips. For example, the sample interactive process that we talked about today started its journey a long time ago as an effective accommodation practice article. Next up, we have our Jan training events and resources page. Here you can register for upcoming Jan webcasts or view archived webcasts if you were not lucky enough to register before things filled up. There are also role play videos that give a live example of what an interactive discussion can and should look like, as well as showcases for specific accommodation solutions that we might suggest to you. Finally, we have Jan's Workplace Accommodation Toolkit. It is a free, comprehensive online resource for employers seeking to move beyond basic compliance with the ADA in order to create more disability-inclusive workplaces. The toolkit provides guidance and resources for developing or updating accommodation policies and processes, and leverages the best proven practices available to date to do so. The toolkit contains actionable accommodation policies and processes from leading U.S. businesses, a suite of forms, training presentations, and role-play videos modeling inclusive behaviors. The toolkit also includes best and emergency practices for creating an inclusive workplace for people with disabilities during all phases of the employment lifecycle. Within the toolkit, you will find drawers specifically for recruiting and hiring managers, supervisors and managers, internal reasonable accommodation subject matter experts, information technology team members, and also employees with disabilities and their allies too. So there's something for everybody in there. Okay, and with that, that concludes our training today. So let's go ahead and open up to questions and see how many we can get through before our time runs out.
Thank you, Matthew, for all that great information. And I want to remind people as we're going through that we're unable to give specific legal or medical advice out, but we will move into the Q&A portion and try and get to some of those. We did have a number of questions submitted during the webinar, so Matthew, if you're able to give us a few extra minutes, we may run over time.
Oh, sure.
Awesome. And just reminding folks, it will be recorded. If you have to log off right at 2 o'clock, you will get the recording sent to you. So let's get started. Do you have any suggestions for when you need to drive a car in hot, humid weather for at long distance?
Yeah. So for that one, first of all, make certain to use that onboard air conditioning in your fans. Keep that AC charged as much as you can so that way you're getting the most bang for your buck with that cold air. If you have a remote start option for the car, it can be really helpful to use that to start the car in the AC about 5 minutes before you would normally go out to get in the vehicle. If you have clients that also have to ride in your car and they start to complain about it being too cold, then I would just be upfront and inform them that you have to keep the car really cold. They might want to bring a jacket to wear while they're riding in it, or you can provide them things like blankets and stuff to use too if they get too cold.
How do you have any suggestions for how to repair a reputation after being unreliable when symptoms get in the way of working in person?
So I would say to start off by providing data on your reliability when you are able to work remotely. So how can you meet your deadlines or complete your projects or achieve your required metrics despite not being there in person? Draw attention to what they see as this previous unreliability to really being an unmet accommodation need that's not something that's innate to you. If you can create that division between what you're seeing as unreliability was actually me not being effectively accommodated, after I was accommodated, look at how reliable I was. I feel like that's the best way to get that working in a more positive direction.
Yeah. We had a related question come up during the webinar. It's kind of a bit long-winded. My boss is concerned that by giving me an accommodation, other staff, coworkers will be resentful or think that my work group is not pulling their full weight. For example, 6 out of 8 groups have had to return in person full time. However, the remaining two have a greater load of work that can be completed at home. So kind of how to navigate the perception, not just with your boss directly, but with your coworkers without sharing medical information or your accommodation.
Sure. So yeah, that can be a difficult situation. What I would say, first of all, is we would want to start by having a conversation with the managers, with HR, about the fact that if people are having issues with you having this accommodation, they need to be prepared for how they are going to handle those questions if they get them. So what I usually encourage in those situations would be for the supervisors or for HR to be like, yep, that person's working from home. It's something that we allow, it's approved. And if you need that as well, talk to us. Let us know what you need so that we can see if we can allow that for you as well. Because they would have to consider this for them too if it was a valid ADA reason. So I feel like that's the best way to go about it. It was approved. If you need it, let us know why, and we'll consider it. For you, though, specifically, I think the best way for you to handle that is if your employer is good about answering those questions in that way, I just refer those questions to them. That's their job. You shouldn't be having to deal with that. That's what they're for. They should be taking the heat for you in that regard. But if you don't have a very good rapport with them and they're not really doing that, I would encourage you to kind of give a similar answer. I came to them, told them why I needed it. They thought about it, they approved it. Here's the person I talked to if you feel like you need it too. You don't have to divulge anything about your medical needs to do that. You can just let them know that, yeah, I talked to them and they allowed it.
Are requirements for accommodations more stringent if the employer is a federal agency? Will accommodations for contractors or visitors doing business with a federal agency be expected to meet a higher standard of compliance?
So not necessarily a higher standard. The ADA is pretty even in regards to what is required. One thing I do think is important to note, though, is that federal employers are technically, and this is one of those like super technical things, they're not technically covered by the ADA itself. They're covered by the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which is kind of the parent law that the ADA was birthed out of. So it's a lot of the times a technicality without much of a difference. The rules are almost identical, but it is important to keep in mind because there might be some small differences here and there depending upon really specific case level details. But in general, no, the requirements are the same.
I've got another two-part question here. Someone asked what accommodations employers are required by law to provide, and kind of a related question, what happens if the employer determines that the accommodation creates an undue hardship?
Okay, so for the first one, employers are required by law to provide quote unquote reasonable accommodations that do not amount to an undue hardship on them. So reasonable, if we want to think about that in the simplest terms possible, reasonable is a very, very low bar. Basically, the way that I encourage employers to think about that is if you pull a random person off the street and say, hey, say that you have an employee that has a back issue. Does it seem reasonable to give that person a special chair so that they can work without pain? That person says, yeah, that seems pretty reasonable to me. Yeah, there you go. That's pretty much the threshold that they need to meet. It's a very low bar. Undue hardship is the real hurdle because reasonable, basically anything can be reasonable. Undue hardship is, well, if the employer can't realistically provide it, they don't have to allow it. And undue hardship is a relatively high bar for them to meet. It's meant to only be something that employers can bring out whenever it's genuinely far too burdensome to allow it. So it's not something that you should necessarily worry about too much, I don't think, but it is something to be mindful of, that if we're asking for something that, say it's really expensive and you have a small employer, maybe they might not be able to afford that. Maybe that is an undue hardship. But if we're talking about Google, Yeah, it might not be. They probably got the money for it.
Is there a third party that you would recommend reaching out to if your employer is claiming something is an undue hardship that you would like to dispute?
So that would be, there's a couple of places that I would encourage people to contact for that. Certainly the EEOC, they can file a claim with them, get mediation through them, or have an investigation done. There's also your state level ADA enforcement agency, which can sometimes be able to get to you more quickly because the EEOC takes cases from across the country. Naturally, there's going to be fewer callers to the state level one. Then there's also your local protection and advocacy organizations. They offer a different sort of service that can be helpful. They essentially provide legal advice and advocacy services. So if people don't want to go to the enforcement level, but kind of just want someone there to, you know, be their person in their corner and kind of help them have that conversation without there being any like threat of action against the employer, protection and advocacy can help with that too.
If someone has more cognitive symptoms like memory, with a highly analytical corporate executive position, what types of accommodations have you seen for that?
So that's something where I would encourage you to reach out to our cognitive team for the best advice, because that's their area of specialty. I do know that we have a lot of pages on our A to Z lists for this. We have a lot of by limitation pages for things like memory loss, things like that, attention, concentration, all that stuff is what I would encourage you to check out. Like if you were to get me and say, hey, I have another question, that's what I would be encouraging you to look at because it probably will answer your question. But if it's a highly analytical corporate executive position, you probably want to talk to the experts, and our cognitive team is likely the ones to get you the best information there.
If additional breaks are allocated as an accommodation, is it a fair expectation that the workday hours will be extended for that additional amount of time?
Yeah, that's usually how we would encourage it to be done. When we're talking about that, the two ways that an employer would handle it is by extending the workday or allowing the time to be made up. So that way, the working hours, quote unquote, is the normal amount. And if that's not possible due to the schedule just really not being flexible enough, then we can allow unpaid leave. But that's obviously less preferable because then we're taking a cut in pay and no one wants that.
Um, is it related? Is it a reasonable request to reduce a person's hours, pay them the same if the duties are not reduced and expected to be completed in fewer hours?
Okay, hold on. Let me read that one myself so I
Yeah,
can make certain I understand it.
this is a fatigue and stress accommodation.
So if we're talking about reducing hours, that can be complicated because if we're talking about an hourly position, like not an exempt position, not a salary position, but an hourly position, and that sort of a job, then naturally your pay is structured on how many hours you put in. But if you're a salary, then you have that specific amount that you're being paid regardless of the amount of your hours that you're working. So the answer there is going to really depend upon what sort of a job it is. If it's hourly, then yeah, your pay might be docked if you're working less than that amount of hours. If you're salary, then maybe not. Maybe your job it fluctuates. Some salary jobs, you have busy seasons and you have less busy seasons, and it's kind of built into the job that that fluctuation will happen. So it might not necessarily happen with salary, but if it's hourly, yeah, you're probably going to have a reduction in pay if you have less hours.
On your example with the service animal, someone asked for a clarification when someone brings a service animal into their work, they are not allowed to ask about the medical condition. They are only allowed to ask what service the animal is trained to provide. Are you implying that employers are able to ask for more information from their employees?
Right. Keep in mind that, like we said at the beginning, we only talk about Title I of the ADA here, and service animals are something that's treated very differently under different parts of the ADA. So when we're talking about workplaces, the employer treats service animals like any other accommodation. So they only have to consider the accommodation if it's medically needed. Therefore, they have a right to know why you need it. And they also have a right to know that the dog is properly trained to help you with your disability and also not be a disturbance to the workplace, too. So, yeah, if we're talking about a work site, they're allowed to get information on your medical needs so they can make certain this is a valid accommodation issue. But if we're talking about, like, say, a grocery store and you're bringing the service animal into that public grocery store as a customer, yeah, the issue there is totally different. The rules are totally separate. And those differing rules get muddied a lot for people. So it's important to keep in mind if it's employment, it's treated like any other accommodation, just with making certain that dog is properly trained too.
Do you have a resource to recommend to welcome visitors with disabilities? I would like to insist that our new playground, which has yet to be built, is fully accessible and we are receiving resistance.
Hmm. So if we're talking about wanting to make certain that this place is inclusive for people with disabilities, like say physically inclusive, like actually able to be used by people with disabilities, I would say the best resource for that would be the United States Access Board. They govern the portion of the ADA that is all about the nitty-gritty details about place being physically accessible. You know, there's specific number of inches that toilets need to be off the floor. There's specific inches that hallways need to be. All of that nitty-gritty details is governed by the access. So if you're seeking guidance on how to help make certain that this playground is going to be accessible for people with disabilities, they're going to be your best resource for that. And once you talk with them, I'm certain they have plenty of strategies to help you be able to advocate for those changes when they're needed.
Excellent. And then final question. Uh, you went over this a little bit, but I'll just have you maybe rephrase.
Sure.
Do you specifically have to tell the manager that you need an accommodation and why you need that accommodation?
So remember, you're allowed to use plain English whenever you're requesting an accommodation. So that means you don't need to use any special words, like there's no magic word that you have to use. You just need to make certain that your employer understands that you have some sort of a medical issue and need some sort of change in your job because of that medical issue. That is enough for it to be considered an accommodation request. The employer will likely be gathering more specific information than that down the line, but that is all you need to be worried about whenever you're first making the request. I have X medical issue. I need Y accommodation because of it. That's all you need to worry about.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Those were some really great questions. If your question wasn't answered fully or you've got new questions, I would encourage you to reach out directly to Jan. It sounds like they've got a lot of really great folks ready to help. Thank you, Matthew, for this presentation today. And just another reminder that we will be archiving this on mscenter.org and YouTube. And if you are interested in getting future education programs from us, make sure that you are on our mailing list. So thank you.
Thank you very much. You all have a good rest of your day.